The Ice Age was not a single winter, but an era of unending cold, a slow suffocation of warmth across the earth. Snow fell on lands that had never known frost before, creeping into the valleys and forests like an invader. Rivers turned to glass. Mountains grew teeth of ice, and the wind howled like a beast without end. For early humans, this was the crucible that would define their existence. They were fragile, soft-skinned creatures armed with crude tools and fragile hopes, yet they walked into a world that demanded more than strength. It demanded adaptation, imagination, and community. Before the ice came, their ancestors had lived under open skies, roaming savannas where fruit and game were abundant. They had no need for shelter beyond trees or the shade of cliffs. But now, with the world turned pale and merciless, the open ground became a death sentence. The sun no longer offered warmth, and the nights could kill a body in hours. To live meant to find protection, not only from predators, but from the cold itself. The first shelters were accidents of nature. Great caves carved by rivers, hollows in cliff faces, cracks between boulders. Small groups of early humans sought refuge in these stone bellies. They brought branches and animal hides to block the wind, and the flicker of fire cast trembling shadows on the walls. It was here, in the darkness, that the first true homes were born. The caves became more than hiding places. They became sanctuaries, wombs of survival where the species learned to endure. The fire that had once been a curiosity became sacred. Inside the cave, its glow meant life. Around it, families huddled, exchanging warmth and safety. The smoke clung to the ceilings, blackening the rock and leaving silent records of their presence. The smell of burning wood mixed with the musk of animal fat and the dampness of the earth. Time passed slowly inside these shelters, marked only by the crackle of fire and the distant cry of wolves outside. But caves were rare, and not every group could find one. As herds of mammoth and reindeer moved, so too did the hunters who followed them. They needed shelter they could carry, rebuild, and adapt. This need sparked one of humanity's first great acts of invention. They looked to the world around them, the bones of beasts, the hides of the slain, the branches stripped bare by wind and frost. From these they began to craft homes with their own hands. The earliest tents were crude, but miraculous in their simplicity. A ring of mammoth tusks was driven into the frozen ground, ribs of giants forming the skeleton of a dwelling. Over it, thick hides were stretched and pinned with stones. Inside, a small fire could burn without the wind stealing its heat. These were houses of the Ice Age, bone huts that turned death into survival. Imagine the ingenuity. Each structure built with no blueprint, no teacher, only instinct and need. The people learned that air was their enemy, that every gap meant lost warmth. They sealed the hides with animal fat, making the coverings weatherproof. They placed stones around the fire pit to trap heat, and dug shallow hollows in the floor where they could sleep closer to the earth's warmth. Some even layered moss and dried grass as primitive insulation. The shelters transformed the human relationship with the land. No longer were they wanderers without defense. They had created bubbles of life in a frozen wasteland. The wind could rage and the snow could fall, but inside, the glow of fire and the murmur of voices stood against the silence of extinction. And yet, each new discovery carried its own cost. The bones that built their homes came from the beasts they hunted, and to hunt those beasts meant venturing out into the killing cold. The shelters were victories carved from death itself. For every safe night, there were days of hunger, fear, and exhaustion. The people learned to build not only with their hands, but with their memories, passing down the secrets of survival from one generation to the next. Children learned where to place the fire so smoke escaped through cracks. Women learned which hides kept out the rain and which rotted too quickly. Men learned to choose ground where melting snow would not flood their shelter. Over time, these lessons became traditions, and traditions became the architecture of survival. Still, the ice pressed harder. Storms became longer, prey scarcer. Even the caves could turn treacherous. Ice would creep in, or ceilings would collapse under frost. The people learned to move again, to take their shelters apart and rebuild them elsewhere. Mobility was life. Their world was a chessboard of glaciers and tundra, and they were the clever pieces that refused to be frozen in place. But something was happening beneath the surface of survival. Inside the shelters, humanity began to grow inwardly. Around those fires, stories were born. Faces glowed in the firelight as words took shape. Stories of the hunt, of lost kin, of spirits in the snow. Shelter gave them time, and time gave them thought. The world outside was ruled by instinct and death, but inside, imagination began to awaken. The shelters were not only physical walls against the cold, they were the birthplace of culture. By the end of the first great ice age, humanity had changed forever. They were no longer merely survivors. They were builders, thinkers, adapters. The cold had tested them, and instead of breaking, they learned to shape the world itself. And yet the cold was not done with them. As glaciers grew and temperatures fell again, they would be pushed to their limits once more. Their shelters would evolve, their fires would burn brighter, and their determination to live would forge a legacy stronger than stone or ice. The age of the shelter builders had only just begun. The Ice Age tightened its grip with every passing generation. The world had become an endless theater of white, a stage set with frozen lakes, towering glaciers, and winds that cut through bone. The people who survived were no longer mere wanderers. They had begun to understand the earth as a living thing, something to read and shape. They were architects born of necessity, engineers forged by fear. Their minds evolved with every storm. Observation became their greatest weapon. They watched how animals sheltered themselves. Foxes burrowing deep under snow, mammoths using their bodies to block the wind, wolves curling into tight circles to conserve heat. Humans imitated and learned. They were not the strongest nor the fastest, but they were the most adaptable. And from this adaptability rose a mastery that no other creature possessed, the ability to create shelter where none existed. Caves remained their strongholds, but over time, humans began to transform them. What once were dark, damp holes became warm, structured dwellings. The walls were lined with hides, the floors layered with grasses and moss. Entrances were blocked with stones to stop the icy gusts. They began carving out alcoves for tools and storing bones for later use. Fire pits were carefully placed to avoid smoke buildup. These caves became more than shelter. They were the first true homes, organized, intentional, efficient. For the nomadic groups that roamed open tundra, nature offered no stone walls. So they built their own. Mammoth bones became the framework, a resource both grim and practical. The remains of the hunted giants were transformed into domes and arches. Each tusk, each rib was placed with purpose. Large femur bones acted as support beams, while reindeer hides formed the outer covering. Inside, fires burned at the center, and the heat reflected off the bone, warming the space far better than hide alone ever could. Archaeologists in our time would one day uncover these strange dwellings along ancient riverbanks, circular structures of bone and ivory, perfectly balanced. Some were large enough to hold 20 people, evidence of communal living. The people who built them were not primitive drifters. They were planners, designers, and survivors who understood the laws of structure long before any blueprint was drawn. But survival was not just about building walls. It was about endurance. Every new layer of ice, every storm, forced innovation. When mammoths migrated and bones grew scarce, humans turned to wood and stone. They scavenged driftwood from frozen rivers, lashed it with sinew, and used animal fat to waterproof their coverings. Over time, they learned that snow itself could be an ally. Packed snow became a form of insulation, not cold but protective. Within snow shelters, temperatures could remain survivable even when the outside world froze solid. Each region gave birth to its own architecture. In the south, where winters were milder, shelters of reeds and clay took shape along river valleys. In the north, structures were low and compact, hugging the earth to resist wind. Some were even half dug into the ground, forming pits that trapped the earth's natural warmth. Across continents, these early builders adapted to their environments with uncanny precision. Within these shelters, something remarkable began to happen. A shift from fear to stability. For the first time in human history, people could stay in one place for longer periods. They could store food, craft tools, and protect their children without constant movement. This stability planted the first seeds of society. Clans grew closer, roles formed. Some specialized in hunting, others in building or maintaining the hearth. The idea of home was no longer fleeting. It was real, tangible, sacred. Inside these shelters, families gathered around the fire not only for warmth, but for connection. Every flicker of flame reflected in their eyes as stories were passed down, as laughter echoed against stone walls. In these moments, humanity became more than a collection of survivors. It became a community bound by shared struggle. As generations passed, the shelters themselves began to carry meaning. The choice of location mattered deeply. Groups chose high ground for safety, near rivers for water, and close to migration routes for hunting. They built windbreaks and used piles of stones to mark safe paths. Even decoration appeared. Carvings on bone, pigments on walls. These markings were not random. They were symbols of identity, belonging, memory. In the depths of one such shelter, perhaps a young child traced their hand against the wall, pressing it into pigment and leaving a red outline that would survive for tens of thousands of years. A signature of existence, a declaration that we were here. The shelters were no longer just protection from the cold. They had become expressions of human spirit. Still, the battle against nature was relentless. Food grew scarce in the heart of winter. Herds moved south, and the hunters followed. Entire groups would abandon their shelters, leaving behind everything they had built. For some, the return was impossible. Snow buried the entrances. Ice claimed the walls. Yet wherever they went, they carried their knowledge. The next shelter would be stronger, smarter, better. Every storm was a teacher. Every collapse, a lesson. Humanity's understanding of structure evolved like their tools, shaped by trial and pain. They learned that curved shapes resisted wind better than flat ones, that smaller openings preserved heat, that certain woods crackled less and smoked less when burned indoors. These were discoveries made not by engineers, but by desperate survivors who learned through experience and loss. Through all this, one truth became clear. Survival was not about dominance, but adaptation. The Ice Age did not bend to human will. Humans bent to it, and in doing so, they grew into the kind of beings who could someday bend the world itself. Each shelter, no matter how small or temporary, carried within it the essence of human resilience, a barrier between warmth and death, between night and hope. The shelters of the Ice Age were monuments to a simple truth, that survival begins not with strength, but with the courage to build, even when the world seems determined to destroy. And as the cold deepened and new generations emerged, humans would take that courage further than ever before, building not only homes but entire communities, and perhaps the first sparks of civilization itself. The frozen world was vast and merciless, but inside those shelters humanity's heartbeat endured. The Ice Age stretched on like a story without end. Winters bled into one another, and the seasons no longer followed the rhythm they once did. For early humans, this was life, an unbroken trial of endurance. Yet within the small warmth of their shelters, something profound was taking shape. What began as survival was slowly transforming into identity. Inside those bone huts, those low wooden frames and smoke-blackened caves, early humans were learning to live, not just exist. The fire that crackled at the center of every dwelling became the true heart of humanity. It was not merely light or heat. It was order in the chaos, safety in the unknown. Around that glowing center, the world outside, the roaring wind, the prowling predators, ceased to matter. The hearth was a symbol of home, and home became sacred. Fire had taught humans control. Shelter taught them belonging. Each dwelling was a miniature world where life unfolded in patterns of cooperation and ritual. The oldest among them sat closest to the fire, passing down stories and skills. Children were taught to weave grasses, patch hides, and keep the flames alive through the night. Women prepared food, tanned skins, mended garments. Men returned from the hunt and repaired weapons, their breath forming mist that vanished into the warm air. Every movement was part of a rhythm that would one day evolve into culture. In the flickering glow of the hearth, humans found time to think beyond the next meal or the next storm. They began to dream. They etched shapes on bone, carved animals into ivory, painted their walls with images of the hunt. These were not idle acts. They were reflections of a mind expanding beyond instinct. Within shelter, the first sparks of imagination burned. Scholars today call these moments the birth of symbolic thought, the ability to represent the world, to express what cannot be touched. But for the people of the Ice Age, it was something simpler, something deeper, the birth of hope. When they painted a bison on a cave wall, they were not decorating. They were believing that the hunt would succeed, that life would continue. The shelter gave them the stillness to imagine such things. The hearth became the stage for the first human rituals. When a hunter did not return, his companions gathered around the fire to remember him. When a child was born, the fire was fed with new wood, a flame for a new life. The fire was alive in their minds. It breathed, it needed, it comforted. Around it, early humans began to whisper to unseen forces, to the spirits of the animals they hunted, to the ancestors they buried, to the world that both nurtured and punished them. With shelter came memory. The walls of their dwellings became more than protection. They were containers of time. Every soot mark, every scratch, every handprint told a story. Generations shared the same spaces, and in doing so, created the first true sense of continuity. The world outside was ever-changing, but inside those walls there was a sense of permanence. The Ice Age may have shaped their bodies, but shelter shaped their souls. It taught them the value of the collective. Alone, no one could build or maintain a home. Together, they could create something that outlasted the storm. The act of building itself was a language. When one man placed a stone, another followed. When one woman stitched a hide, another tied it in place. Without words, they spoke through cooperation. The shelters were a reflection of unity, and unity was survival. As their shelters improved, so did their social bonds. People began to live in clusters, small groups of huts or caves forming the earliest communities. In these clusters, ideas spread. One group's method of building or heating or insulating would travel with visitors, merging with others. Innovation multiplied like sparks from a fire. Across continents, people who never met shared the same instinct: to build, to warm, to live. It was within these early settlements that the first notion of territory emerged. A cave was no longer just an empty space. It was their cave. A ring of stones or a line of bones marked boundaries. Protecting one's shelter became an act of defending one's identity. The world outside was vast and cold, but within these small circles of warmth, early humans began to define belonging. Still, survival was always a battle. The Ice Age had no mercy for weakness. Storms would flatten tents, floods would sweep through valleys, fires would die in the wind. There were nights when entire families huddled together and did not wake. Yet even in the face of such loss, humans rebuilt. Over and over they raised new shelters from ruin. Resilience became their inheritance. Somewhere in that long, cold age, humanity crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer reacting to the environment. They were shaping it. With each new dwelling, they declared their defiance against extinction. The world could freeze, but they would not vanish. When the wind tore through the tundra, the sound would echo like a ghostly song. But inside the shelters, another sound grew stronger. The quiet murmur of life, the whispers of mothers soothing children, the clack of stones being shaped into blades, the low hum of stories retold through generations. These were the sounds of a species learning not only to survive, but to endure through memory, through craft, through care. The Ice Age demanded more than strength. It demanded that humans build more than walls. It demanded that they build meaning. Every hearth they lit, every hide they stitched, every bone they raised into a frame was an act of rebellion against the cold emptiness of the world. And from that rebellion rose something eternal, the human will to create warmth, even in the darkest cold. In those small glowing shelters, the seed of humanity's future was burning, quietly, steadily, unyielding. The sun, dim and pale, rose slowly over the white horizon. A vast tundra stretched endlessly, its silence broken only by the distant groan of shifting ice. The cold bit deep, but beneath thick furs and bone necklaces, a tribe of hunters stirred, readying themselves for what would be one of their most daring hunts yet. Food was scarce. The herds had moved farther north, chasing the last patches of dry grass buried beneath snow. If they failed today, their firelight would fade within days. The leader, Aruk, stood tall among them, his breath a white mist. His eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon where the earth shimmered with frost. In his hand, he held a spear tipped with chipped flint, the shaft wrapped in mammoth sinew. His people had trained for days, mapping the movements of a mighty beast they called Kor, an enormous woolly mammoth that roamed the frozen plains. To kill such a creature meant survival. Meat, bones for tools, tusks for trade, and hides for warmth. To fail meant starvation. As the group moved out, each step crunched over icy soil. They walked in silence, faces painted with ash, eyes narrowed against the wind. Women and children stayed behind at the caves, feeding the fires and whispering quiet prayers to the spirits of the hunt. The hunters reached a ridge overlooking the valley. There it was. The mammoth, enormous and ancient, lumbering through the snow, trunk sweeping for roots beneath the frost. Its breath rose like steam, its shadow stretching long across the ice. The tribe spread out in a half circle, each man and woman taking their place. They carried torches, spears, and sharpened stones tied to heavy sticks. The plan was simple: drive the beast toward the trap they dug the day before. Deep pits camouflaged with branches and snow waited for the moment when fear would guide the mammoth's steps into its end. A signal came, a low, haunting whistle made from a hollow bone. Then chaos erupted. Hunters shouted and waved their torches, the sound echoing across the plain. The mammoth bellowed, confused and enraged, its great tusks thrashing the air. Spears flew. Some struck deep, others shattered on thick hide. The animal charged, shaking the ground beneath it. The hunters scattered, regrouping, their eyes burning with both fear and determination. Aruk shouted commands, urging them closer. They drove the beast toward the hidden pit. The ground cracked. The mammoth stumbled, one leg sinking into the trap. The air filled with its thunderous cry. The tribe closed in, stabbing with spears, chanting to the rhythm of survival itself. It was a desperate struggle. One mistake could mean death under a single swing of its tusks, but unity held them strong. When the beast finally fell, silence returned, heavy and cold. The hunters stood trembling, breathless, faces streaked with sweat and snow. Around them, the air reeked of blood and steam. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Aruk lifted his spear and shouted, a cry that carried through the valley, reaching even the caves far away. The others joined in, their voices merging into one raw, victorious roar. By dusk, they had begun the work. Knives of stone cut through thick hide, the meat carved and divided carefully. Nothing would be wasted. The bones would be shaped into needles, sled runners, and weapons. The fat would be burned for light. The hide would become shelter and clothing. Even the tusks would be carved into sacred symbols of power and protection. Back at camp, the hunters returned like heroes. Fires blazed high and the smell of roasted meat filled the night. The elders sang songs of the great hunt, of courage, loss, and triumph. Children listened wide-eyed, learning that life was not given freely but earned through struggle and unity. In the flicker of the flames, Aruk sat quietly, his face marked by both pride and grief. 2 hunters had fallen that day, crushed beneath the mammoth's rage. Their names would be remembered in every story, every dance. The fire crackled beside him, throwing shadows across the cave walls where the tribe ES artists had already begun to paint, the mammoth S shape taking form in red ochre and black soot. It was more than a victory, it was a reminder. The world was harsh, merciless, but through fire, will, and togetherness, they endured. Outside, the night grew colder, but within the caves, warmth and light glowed, a fragile defiance against the endless Ice Age dark. And so, the hunt became legend, a story passed through generations, painted on stone, whispered by flames, echoing in the wind across the frozen earth. After the great hunt, the tribe's fires burned brighter than ever. But as the weeks passed, the warmth of victory faded into the creeping weight of a new winter, one unlike any they had known. The wind howled across the plains with a voice that never ceased, and the sun, once pale and distant, now barely rose at all. The sky stayed dark for days, and then weeks, a twilight that turned the land into a ghostly, frozen silence. Inside the caves, the people huddled together. The air smelled of smoke, meat, and wet fur. Children cried softly at night, frightened of the endless dark outside. The fire was their only guardian, a living creature that demanded constant feeding. Without it, death would slip silently into their shelter. Aruk knew this too well. He spent sleepless nights feeding wood and bone into the flames, watching sparks rise and die. Food was rationed carefully. The mammoth meat had been dried and stored, but the cold made everything brittle, even hope. Each morning, the hunters went out to check the traps, their faces wrapped in hides, breath freezing on their eyelashes. Often they came back empty-handed. Sometimes they didn't come back at all. The Ice Age had many predators, not all of them beasts. Hunger and despair hunted too. But amid the hardship, new skills began to bloom. The tribe learned to use bone needles to sew tighter clothing, stitching animal hides with sinew thread. They learned to melt snow for water and to make shelters inside the caves with walls of stretched hide and fur, trapping warmth. Every small discovery was precious, a victory of the mind over nature's cruelty. The fire in the center of the cave became more than warmth. It was life itself. Families gathered around it to tell stories of old hunts, of ancestors, of spirits watching from the mountains. The flames danced across the cave walls, bringing the painted mammoths and bison to life. To the children, it seemed as though the ancestors themselves were moving in the light. One evening, as the wind screamed outside, an elder named Tura rose to speak. Her face was lined with the history of many winters. She held a burning stick in her wrinkled hands and said, "This fire is not from the sky. It is from us. It is born from our courage, our struggle, our breath. When the cold takes the land, it is the warmth inside us that fights it back." Her words filled the silence like a prayer. Aruk listened, his heart heavy but steady. He had seen too much death, yet he felt something new stirring in his people. Not just fear, but understanding. The Ice Age had taken much, but it was shaping them into something stronger. They were learning not just to survive, but to adapt. Outside, the world lay frozen. Glaciers creeping slowly across valleys, forests turned to glass under frost. Great beasts wandered aimlessly through the snow, thin and weary. Wolves followed the tribe's scent, their glowing eyes flickering in the dark. But the humans were no longer helpless wanderers. They had become builders, thinkers, and keepers of the flame. The night stretched on endlessly, but the tribe endured. Days were counted by the burning of torches, not by the rising of the sun. Some of the young ones began to carve symbols into the cave walls, spirals, lines, and handprints. They didn't know why, only that it felt right. Perhaps it was their way of saying, "We were here. We lived." One bitter morning, a sound echoed across the plain. Not the cry of a beast, but the breaking of ice. The great river had frozen solid, its surface cracking like thunder. The hunters went out to investigate and found something they had never seen before. Fish trapped beneath the ice, still alive but slow-moving. It was a revelation. They quickly learned to break holes in the ice and catch them with sharpened bone hooks. For the first time in weeks, there was fresh food again. That night, the tribe celebrated. The fire roared, shadows danced, and laughter returned to the cave. The darkness outside remained, but within their hearts, a light had grown brighter. They had conquered the cold with patience and invention. In that moment, Aruch realized something profound, that survival was no longer just about hunting or shelter. It was about creation. Each spark of fire, each new idea, each shared story, these were the weapons that would carry humanity forward through every storm. And as the wind howled across the frozen world, the firemakers sat close together, the flames reflecting in their eyes. A quiet promise that even in the age of endless ice their spirit would never be extinguished. The longest winter in memory began to loosen its grip. The storms came less often, and the snow melted into trickling streams that sang softly through the frozen valleys. The sun, weak but steady, began to rise earlier each day, painting the ice in hues of gold. The air still bit the skin, but for the first time in many moons the people could feel warmth again. Faint, but real. Aruch stepped outside the cave one morning and blinked against the light. The land was still scarred by cold. Trees stripped bare, herds gone silent. But something in the air had changed. He could hear birds again, distant but alive. The river that had been locked in glass began to flow. The world was waking up, and so were his people. Inside, the tribe began to stir from their long hibernation. The children, once huddled near the fire, ventured toward the cave mouth, laughing as they saw the light reflect off the melting snow. The elders smiled faintly. They had endured what once seemed unendurable. They had faced the frozen wrath of the Ice Age and lived to see it fade. Yet the thaw brought new challenges. The melting snow flooded the valley floor, turning paths into rivers. Old shelters collapsed under the weight of softened ice. Carcasses of long-dead beasts emerged from the melting drifts, drawing hungry predators. The world was not merciful, only changing its shape. Aruch gathered the hunters and the builders. Together, they planned to move their camp to higher ground, a ridge overlooking the valley where the sun touched the earth first each morning. They took their tools, their furs, and, most importantly, their fire. As they journeyed, the tribe moved with a rhythm born of experience, careful, patient, and united. At the ridge, they built anew. The firemakers dug small hearths into the ground, lining them with stones. The women stitched hides into tighter walls for the shelters. The men reinforced the entrances with mammoth bones, stacking them in circles that trapped warmth like the embrace of the earth itself. Slowly, a small village took shape, not just a shelter, but a home. In the evenings, when the day's labor was done, the people gathered again around the great fire. They no longer spoke only of survival. They spoke of the future. They wondered what lay beyond the distant hills, if other tribes still lived, if the great herds would return. The world had shrunk in the cold, but now their imaginations stretched farther than ever before. Tura, the elder, looked into the fire and said, "We are no longer just people of the caves. The fire travels with us. Wherever we go, it will follow." Her words carried truth deeper than she knew. The fire was more than a tool now. It was part of humanity's identity, a symbol of continuity, of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. As the days grew longer, something remarkable happened. Plants began to sprout where the snow had melted. Tiny green shoots pushed through the earth, defying the frozen soil. The tribe watched in awe. For the first time, they saw how warmth brought life back to the world, how even after death and darkness, renewal followed. Eruk and the younger hunters began exploring beyond the valley. They discovered new animals, reindeer, smaller and faster than the mammoths, wild horses grazing near thawing plains, and flocks of birds nesting by the rivers. The landscape was transforming. The age of giants was ending, and a new balance was emerging. At night, around the fire, the tribe told stories about the Ice Age, of the days when the sky burned red with storms, when they almost lost the light, when they learned to build, hunt, and endure. The children listened wide-eyed, imagining the cold they had never truly known. The story of survival became their inheritance, proof that courage, cooperation, and the flame of ingenuity could outlast even the harshest world. Aruk sat apart one night, staring into the fire's heart. He thought of those who had fallen, the hunters buried under snow, the children lost to hunger, the friends whose laughter had faded into silence. Every spark that leapt into the dark sky seemed to carry a memory, but he did not mourn. Instead, he felt gratitude for the fire, for his people, and for the gift of endurance. One morning, as the tribe gathered to greet the rising sun, the valley below shimmered with thawing rivers and green fields. Steam rose from the earth like the breath of life returning. For the first time in years, Aruk smiled freely. He knew the ice would come again someday, but when it did, humanity would be ready. They had built shelter not just from bones and hides, but from knowledge and unity. They had learned that survival was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The fire crackled beside them, ancient and eternal, and its light touched every face. In that glow, humanity stood reborn, scarred, wiser, and unbroken. The frozen world had tested them, and they had answered not with surrender, but with creation. The age of ice had forged the age of humankind.